Welcome back, everyone. My name is Austin Revel. I'm owner of 2F by C Tactical. We're here on part 2 of our National Firearms Act historical discussion. And again, I'm just going to briefly say this. I said this in the first chapter. We're going to try to keep this around 10 minutes. We aren't going to discuss deeply about the politics of individual acts. We're just here to talk about the historical tradition, what they purport to do. And then at the very end, a very small section of this will be about the deficiencies of these acts. So where we left off last was talking about the $200 tax stamp. So I really want to put this into perspective. And I did a little digging to see, like, what does $200 mean to someone in 1934? Well, essentially banned pretty much everything NFA from possession. Because you got to think about this. A good paying job for, like, a lawyer was about $8,000 a year. You know, $200 of that, and of course that's before tax. That's not after tax. They still had taxes back in 1934, and thanks to the 1917 amendment about the income tax that Woodrow Wilson did, they had income tax back then as well. So the $8,000 a year, that's for a lawyer. That's like a really good job. Your grocer is not making that, and that's only if. And you got to remember, we're back in Jim Crow, the evilness of Jim Crow. That's only if you're a white person. A black lawyer is going to make maybe half that. For white people, they were making 34 cents to 43 cents an hour, while black people were 17 to 24%, or 17 to 24 cents, I should say. I mean, this horrible discrepancy amongst African Americans and whites is awful. So they basically priced out anyone of African American or any minority, really, ethnic minority, from owning these things. It was only upper liberal, if you will, white people that could own these things, and even them weren't buying them, not in any serious numbers. So just putting that into perspective, I mean, this is an exorbitant amount of money. That's on top of the item itself. We said before in the first chapter that Thompson was already $200. Now you're adding another $200 on top of that. So the point of this was basically to remove them from society. Now, they didn't do necessarily what they do today, and this specifically comes for bringbacks and stuff already in existence. We didn't get the actual registration of bringbacks and all that until 1968. We're going to get to that in the Gun Control Act. So there was things all outside the NFA at this particular moment. That is true. That did happen. But that was all closed off in 68 and then further in 86. And again, we'll get to that in later videos. So when we talk about today, the pistol brace rule, we talked about machine guns. Let's zero in on short barrel rifles. And we're going to skip a little bit ahead and when the discussion of short barrel rifles a little bit, but there's that big discrepancy, right? You got 18 inches for a shotgun, 16 inches for a rifle. Why is that? That's really interesting, actually. The reality is the requirement for both rifles and shotguns was actually at 18 inches in 1934. What the problem was that a bunch of companies, and Sears, Roebuck, and others were selling these 22 rifles that were under 18 inches. And they went to Congress and were like, hey, just so you know, like, you just outlawed everything we were selling. You just said that this is all a violation. And I should also say that the FFL provision doesn't exist yet. You do not have to be a licensed firearms dealer the way you do today in order to sell guns back then. Back then, you could just order them to get shipped straight to your house, the Sears Roebuck catalog, all these other things. That came along a little later in 1968. And again, we'll get to that in the Gun Control Act. So that all these regular companies, not FFLs, these regular companies, mostly machine shops, are like, yeah, you just outlawed all these things we sell. So Congress, I guess to your credit, if you will, went back and revised it down to 16 inches for 22 caliber or smaller rifles. The actual final revision, 16 inches for all of them, would come in 1968 with the Gun Control Act. And the reason for that was in 1962, John F. Kennedy sold to NRA members a bunch, hundreds of thousands of M1 carbines that they had in their stores from World War II in order to raise money for the federal government. Turns out, with a barrel length of 17.25 inches and a caliber of 30 cal, they violated the NFA. The federal government sold NFA violating firearms to the general public. They fixed that retroactively in '68. It wasn't realized at the time. It came about later, and that's where we get the 16 inches for rifles a day, 18 inches for shotguns. Now, what does the 16 inches, 18 inches mean? Well, realistically, it has to do with Italian trench coats. Actually, it has very little to do with firearms. The idea was you couldn't conceal them in an Italian trench coat. That's what the gangsters of the 1920s, 1930s used. So they would do the average length of pull from the hip down to the heel of the average Italian trench coat. It had to be longer than that, right? Makes total sense. Has nothing to do with the firearm itself. That's where we get a lot of this stuff. And again, you just have to go back in time and understand what was going on. Now, where does that bring us today? And this is where the short barrel rifle provision specifically kind of gets a little dicey in terms of pistol braces and all that. So what is the ATF actually citing? Well, they're saying that because there's a thing called the National Firearms Act and there's a definition of short barrel rifles, we can regulate it because the National Firearms Act has been delegated to us in order to run, which is true. Congress did delegate it to the ATF back in 1972, and a judge recently kind of confirmed that, be like, well, there is a thing called a short barrel rifle, and these things are under 16 inches, and they look like rifles to me, so therefore they can do this. That is basically what the judge is saying down in Texas recently, and the reason why the injunction wasn't actually upheld. Which does bring us to the question, and this is where I'm just going to spend a brief moment. We're only going to spend like 3 minutes on this, of what the argument should be. And this is where someone like myself really pushes that we need to quit talking about pistol braces. We need to start talking about the National Firearms Act, the constitutionality of it. No, short barrel rifles aren't dangerous than usual. There's like 2.6 million of them in the NFA, in civilian hands, and that's registered ones. We're not talking about pistol braces here. We're just talking about short barrel rifles in everyone's hand. And that's, I would make the argument, common use. Thanks to the Catano case several years ago, it held that stun guns at 203,000 in civilian hands is considered common use. 2.6 million seems common use to me. So that's where the ATF is citing. They're citing National Firearms Act language. Now they're writing in, obviously, an attachment that they said was fine before that didn't exist back in 1934. Obviously, the AR-15 has not been invented yet. Most guns, in and of themselves, are all metal, milled specifically, with some stamped exceptions, though most of the stamping stuff comes in World War II out of necessity of raw materials and speed. And guns all were contained within one item. This is the frame receiver, right? The actual gun part. That contained both the fire control group, the barrel, and the all the internals, right? And that's the way it's actually written in the National Firearms Act, frame and receiver. It houses all three. That's not true today. That's where, this act is behind the times in terms of just firearm innovation over time. And that brings us to pistol braces, right? That's where we are. When it comes to short barrel shotguns, again, we do have some discrepancy. The Mossberg 500, or excuse me, the 590 Shockwave is fine. But somehow, if I was to go on with a 14.5-inch barrel, I might add you, but that's not a short barrel rifle or a short barrel shotgun. But if I took my Remington 870 and took 3.5 inches off, I'm in trouble, right? And that's where these discrepancies end up coming in. And I want to stress that that's what the purpose of this is. Like, why are we here? And I think if we talk more about the individual laws, we can see why they need to go away. And that's the purpose of these videos. I really appreciate you checking in with us on the National Firearms Act. And we are going to be doing the Gun Control Act of 1968 next. So I look forward to going through that with you. See you next time.